Again, want to thank the team from Gray Robinson for coming up today. They've done this for, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years now. It's kind of become a tradition, and they do a great job with it. So thank you to them for being here. I'm going to call up now Chris Dawson, who's native of Northwest Florida. He knows us well and has just done a great job representing us, and looking forward to hear from him. Robert Stuart will be joining him as well. And they also have Carlisha Collins, who's not presenting today, but is part of the team and came very important part and came to join us today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Dawson.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Thanks again to the Chamber for having us this morning. I think it's our 8th year doing this presentation, wrapping up the legislative session, which is always an honor to come over and share with a friendly crowd, a hometown crowd for me, what happened during the legislative session, what's going on in politics and governance around our state. And I think as we all feel, really the state of the state of our Florida government is exceptionally strong from a financial standpoint and from a policy standpoint. And we saw another exceptionally productive session this year from the Florida Legislature. We're going to walk you through some of what they worked on this year and some of the funding priorities that made it through the process as well. But as we like to do with every legislative wrap-up, of course, we want to first talk about some of the personalities and some of the players in the process. These are largely unchanged from last year. Of course, our governor continues to be a strong governor for the state. He has put forward over the last couple years some of the most transformative policy proposals that we've seen in decades, frankly, and has really helped shepherd in, I think, a lot of the economic success that we're seeing. James Uthmeyer, his chief of staff, has remained in that role from essentially day one of his administration, or certainly early in his administration. Also, for a portion of last year, was loaned over to the presidential campaign, but has since returned to the chief of staff position. And then rounding out the governor's team there, the legislative affairs director, Peter Cutterman, is new to that role for this year. And Chris Spencer over at OPB has been with the governor since day one as well. Was recently announced that after the work is done on this legislative session, Chris is going to go over and head up the State Board of Administration. So he'll be leaving that role. And then lastly, our cabinet rounded out by Wilton Simpson, Commissioner of Agriculture, Ashley Moody, our Attorney General, and of course, our fellow Northwest Floridian, Jimmy Petronas, our Chief Financial Officer. Over on the House side, leadership remained the same again this year. Speaker Paul Renner from the Jacksonville area will go down as one of the most productive speakers from a standpoint of amount of legislation passed. We've seen really 2 back-to-back years of near-record legislation, and we'll talk about some of those top-line numbers here in a moment. Over on the Senate side, again, same leadership under Senate President Kathleen Passidomo, as well, of course, our friend and delegation member Doug Broxson as the Appropriations Chairman for a second year, helped shepherd in really some incredible numbers for Northwest Florida. Over looking at our delegation, of course, say it every year, but it has to be said again, we have an exceptional delegation, not only in Escambia County, but really throughout Northwest Florida. When you talk about the legislature, you know, there are 160 members of the legislature, 120 in the House, 40 in the Senate. We have to put up a unified front when it comes to being from the Panhandle, really from Pensacola over to the Panama City area, is a delegation in and of itself, and they stay lockstep in working to promote Northwest Florida in our legislature. Over on the Senate side as well, again, Senator Doug Broxson and then Jay Trumbull, who is a future Senate president. Looking at upcoming leadership, we do know because of term limits who the incoming leaders are going to be for the next several years. Of course, Senator Jim Boyd is from the Tampa area. He will serve as Senate president, followed by Jay Trumbull from Panama City. Then on the House side, we'll have Representative Sam Garrison. He's from the Clay County delegation over near Jacksonville. Will be one of our future speakers, as well as Jennifer Kennedy from Lakeland, who is going to be the first female speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. And again, some top line numbers from the session, just to give you an idea of what a typical session looks like. 1,900 bills filed this year. Of that, 325 passed through the legislature, so passed both chambers, will go to the governor's desk for consideration. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, that is a very productive session by normal standards. Usually we see 250 to 300 bills passed, and for the last couple of years, we've seen well into the 300s on number of bills passed. So really a productive couple of years for the Florida legislature. And then also on the state budget, the legislature passed a $117 billion budget this year. I'll go into some of the details on how that budget breaks down, but that's about a $2 billion reduction from the budget that the legislature passed last year. It was passed out of the House and Senate at about $119 billion. The reason for that is because a lot of the federal stimulus that we've seen coming out of D.C. is starting to dry up, whether it's the COVID dollars or the infrastructure or the Tax Reduction Act. All of that federal money has essentially stopped flowing, so the legislature really took the opportunity to make sure that our budget was right-sized for Florida and for our revenues here in the state. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert to talk a little bit about some of the leadership priorities that drove the conversation this year.
Thank you, Chris, and good morning, everybody. I've got the privilege of kind of walking you quickly through in any given session. Every legislative session has its own sort of vibe, its own focus in particular areas, and a lot of times that focus is driven by the governor, the speaker, and the president in terms of what their priorities are. So you ascend to that place of leadership, and it becomes sort of incumbent upon you as the leader to set the agenda for the legislative session as a whole in the governor's case, or for their particular chambers in the House and the Senate for the speaker and president. And so this year was no different, at least in terms of the fact that there were priorities. What was different is the number of them. So you'll recall last session, if you remember our presentation, the governor's priorities were long and significant and big in number. That was at a time when he was ramping up a run for federal office. This year, very different, a much lower number of priorities. You'll remember that the Iowa caucuses fell on the second week of session. So really all those weeks leading up to session when the House and the Senate were in committee weeks, the governor was very much focused on Iowa and not as present in Florida in terms of creating an agenda for the legislative session. So he only had a few this year. In fact, his State of the State address was really light on policy and strong on sort of the greatest hits of his federal talk and telling the legislature to just stay the course. You're doing a great job. The state's in a great place. Keep doing what you're doing. A couple of things that he did have. First was, and these actually, both of these next two really amount to the state of Florida calling on a constitutional convention for a federally balanced budget and for term limits in the Congress. It's been a while since we've had a constitutional convention in America, but now Florida is one of at least a few states that have called on that for these two topics, and that was a big priority of the governor. The third, which ended up happening as a part of the tax package, and Chris will talk about the tax package in a little bit, was insurance tax relief. This amounts, by the time it's all said and done, it amounts to about $130 per policy in tax reduction on your insurance premiums. If you're like me and you just recently got your renewal, that $130 is cool, but not totally meaningful. But it is, from a broad-based perspective, it will touch a lot of people and got wrapped into the tax package in the final days of session. The Speaker had some fairly significant priorities this year, and House Bill 1, which ultimately became House Bill 3, was the largest of those. And this is youth and social media bill. The original bill, House Bill 1, was actually vetoed by the governor, and the legislature got a second bite at the apple in passing House Bill 3. And what it really amounts to is, at what age should our youth be on social media? Already banned from 13 and under at the federal level, it really became a question of that 14 to 15-year-old. House Bill 1, which got vetoed, was a complete ban at 16 and under. The governor wanted to see some parental controls for 14 and 15, and ultimately that's what happened in House Bill 3. And so you've got No social media, basically up to 13, 14 and 15, parental consent, and then 16 and above is when it will be legal in Florida to be on social media. So really an interesting bill that took up a lot of the time and attention in Tallahassee this session. Another one that you'll see on the ballot in November is adjusting the homestead exemption for CPI plus inflation. That'll be on the ballot in November. 60% of the vote will be required of Floridians in order to put that into the Constitution, but it was a big priority of the Speaker to pass this year. And the last one I'll mention for him, for Speaker Renner, was special districts. Really going back to Speaker Renner's first days in office 8 years ago, he, I think to put it lightly, has a distrust of special districts. And so this year was kind of a omnibus, getting our arms around the thousands of special districts that we have around the state, requiring some uniformity in terms of setting goals and objectives, term limits if you have elected folks on your board, those types of things. It was a much bigger bill to start. The Senate really pared it down into something that was more reasonable from their perspective, but this applies to all special districts across the state. President Pasadomo also had her priorities, the main one being Live Healthy Act. So if you'll recall, last year was the Live Local Act, a $700+ million investment into workforce housing. This year, they built upon that with Live Healthy, and also Learn Local. That's a tongue. If you can say that 10 times fast, there's a prize for you at the end. Live Healthy was an $800 million investment into healthcare workforce development and retention, finding a way to attract more healthcare workers to Florida as we grow at literally thousands of people a week. What do we do to make sure that we can live healthy, long, sustainable lives with the healthcare workers that we need in Florida? So there's a lot in this bill. It really was a combination of several bills. There was a lot that happened, but the main point is Florida's investing heavily in workforce retention and recruitment in the healthcare space. The next one, deregulation of public schools. I won't go into all this slide because there's, again, a lot up there, but what I'll explain it this way. Last year, Florida passed perhaps the most comprehensive school choice bill in the history of the United States. Basically, we now have, as if any of you have kids in public school or you follow the school systems, you know that we have school choice in the macro. Money follows the child. You can take that money wherever you want to go. The Senate this year led an effort to basically say, okay, if we're going to have an open, free marketplace in education, we've got to do something for our traditional school districts to be able to compete in that new open marketplace. And so what this bill does is it looses some of the strings on spending, removes what are called categoricals in the FEFP, so that there can be more flexibility in the way that the school districts choose to use their money and what they try to do to compete in this new open marketplace. So really good policy that reflects a movement in the way of choice that happened last year. Chris is going to talk about the budget, and I'll be back up to talk about some bills in just a few minutes.
All right, I mentioned again the top line number on the budget, $117.6 billion. This is how the budget breaks down by category. You can see, as has been the case for a number of years now, Health and Human Services remains the largest piece of the budget pie. But you've got some growing pieces there as well, particularly with education and also with agriculture, environment, and general government. That focuses not only on agriculture, but particularly on water quality, water quantity, which has been a top priority of the governor and the legislature, frankly, for the last 6 or 7 years. Moving over to some quick notes on the budget and some of the big items to sort of headline what happened this year. Again, I mentioned some of the emphasis on budget cutting, making sure that we're not overly reliant on federal dollars coming in as those continue to dry up. We did, again, put away a record number of reserves, over $10 billion into reserves this year, and bought down state debt by $500 million. 3% state worker raise, additional $1.8 billion to the K-12 education system. Robert mentioned the $700 million for Live Healthy and that transformative investment into our healthcare industry. And then as well, a couple of affordable housing priorities, particularly the Hometown Heroes program, again, appropriated $100 million for our first responders, teachers, nurses to assist with first-time home buying. And then lastly, an issue that is not as sexy but has been a growing liability, frankly, for the state is our prison infrastructure. Something that we haven't seen a significant investment in quite a while, and there is well-documented need in that system. So the legislature has appropriated $100 million recurring dollars, so year after year, $100 million to start to catch up on that backlog of capital improvement needs. Some additional big ticket items, and these are the some of the heavy hitters when we get into budget conference every year. Of course, public education spending, the Florida Education Finance Program. The Transportation Work Program continues to get full funding, a big investment in our roads in particular, as well as the Moving Florida Forward program received an additional $370 million in general revenue. That's important to us here in Escambia County because that includes the widening project for I-10. So that was funded this year by the legislature in general revenue. Additional big pots of money that were appropriated to Visit Florida to continue our tourism marketing. The Florida Job Growth Grant Fund, this is the governor's economic development fund that he's able to allocate, receive $75 million. And then again, I talked about the environmental funding that we continue to see year in and year out. So a few pieces of how this breaks down. Again, the $46.5 billion for health and human services, by far the biggest piece of the budget and one that continues to grow. We talked about the Live Healthy. Another notable increase was for nursing homes. Of course, we've got an aging population in Florida, and there's been a lot of need to increase those reimbursement rates and investment in our nursing home facilities. So that was appropriated at $247 million. As well, $40 million there at the bottom for cancer innovation. That continues to be a top priority for the administration. Of course, our First Lady, Casey DeSantis, had a bout with breast cancer that she successfully overcame and now has become a tremendous advocate for funding in that arena. Over on the education side, $30.1 billion. Again, a big chunk of that, of course, public education, but also capital improvements. So the PICO Trust Fund, right there shy of $1 billion. And you'll see in a later slide some of that money finding its way to Northwest Florida for some capital improvements at our higher education institutions. Early learning services, childcare, that was a priority of the legislature this year as well, with some additional appropriation going there. And then our higher education system truly is world-class, and that's not only a couple of institutions. It's not just UF, it's not FSU, truly a world-class system, the number one public education system in the country. And the legislature continues to invest in that system to make it better. And you can see operational funding enhancements provided to all of our major universities across the state. They're on the right side. Moving over into transportation, tourism, economic development, again, talked about the Hometown Heroes program aimed at affordable housing. There were some other grant programs aimed at law enforcement, in particular for law enforcement recruitment bonuses. That's something that the governor has been a tremendous champion on, not only rewarding our law enforcement in the state, but also seeking to recruit additional law enforcement from across the country. Over at DOT, almost $14 billion in the DOT work plan. If you've driven around the state anytime recently, you see it. You see the orange cones. I wish I had gone into the orange cone business rather than the lobbying business, because those guys are killing it. But again, tremendous investment in our state. And Robert mentioned it. With thousands of people moving here a week, it's critically important that we continue to fund those priorities. Again, water, wastewater continues to be a priority for the legislature and for this governor, and we see them continuing to put their investment in this space as well. Conservation as well. We talked about the wildlife corridor last year. That has been a top priority of Senate President Pasadomo, and the legislature has continued to put record funding into conservation, including the Rural and Family Lands program there. Down a little bit down the list here, water projects, that has become sort of the golden goose in Tallahassee. You want to bring home your water project, and we saw tremendous investment in water projects across the state this year, topping over $400 million. And then you'll see on the right there, the environmental resource management. We'll talk about this bill a little bit later, but the legislature has made not only year-over-year investments in water and wastewater quality and conservation, but they've now made a lasting investment by tying gaming revenues from the Seminole Compact to conservation and water quality initiatives. And we'll break that down, but you can see some of the annual investment that's going to be made out of that piece of policy there on the right. Criminal civil justice, again, really the highlight here is that capital improvement investment into the state prison system continues to be a real need that we have, and particularly across the Panhandle as well. We have a lot of those institutions, and so you'll start to see some of those capital improvements find their way into our communities locally. Speaking of local, we, again, tremendous delegation here in Northwest Florida, and they really not only have done an exceptional job of standing up for the state on a policy priority, but also when it comes to funding. And in particular, there are about 12 folks in the legislature that control those purse strings that are in the appropriation suite. We have really the exceptional advantage of having two of those in the delegation. Of course, Senator Broxson has been the budget chairman for the last 2 years. And then as well, Representative Andrade has been a subcommittee chairman on the House side for transportation, tourism, and economic development. And having two people in the room when these decisions are being made, that is how the projects, the money flows to our local area. And so you can see just truly a sampling of some of the tremendous projects that were brought back this year. For our friends at UWF in particular, I'll highlight the $26.2 million for the engineering program, just an exceptional win for their campus there. But again, you'll see water projects on this list. You'll see resilience upgrades for our sheriff's department building, true wins all across the board, and that's thanks to our exceptional delegation. And then Robert mentioned the tax package. The legislature every year has put forward an initiative to try to give back some of these state dollars. We've had the fortunate position of having additional revenues every single year to do a tax package. And we saw a substantial tax package again this year, over $1 billion in tax reductions or tax cuts. You can see some of those listed out here. Robert talked about the insurance premium tax reduction. Strong Families Tax Credit, again, focused on childcare and early learning. That's an exceptionally part of livability, affordability for our young working families. And then the litany of sales tax holidays that we've all become accustomed to. You'll see those again this year. Some of them scaled back just a little bit as we've tightened the belt. Some of those sales tax holidays have gotten shorter, but the Freedom Month sales tax returns, back to school sales tax holiday, again, will happen this time only in the fall. There won't be a January one this year. Tool time returns, as well as the disaster preparedness sales tax holiday, which is coming up here in just a few short weeks. All right, I'm going to hand it to Robert to talk about one of the biggest issues of session this year, which was affordable housing.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, building upon the Live Local bill from last year, the legislature continued to invest in issues related to housing. The first one I'll point out is My Safe Florida Home. This is just kind of a cool program run through the CFO's office. This is a grant program for storm hardening of your homes. And so it was so popular last year, they literally ran out of money in a couple of weeks. When the governor ultimately executes the budget and it becomes law on July 1st, there's another $200 million going into that program. So mysafefloridahome.com, you can check it out, see if you qualify, and pass it around to your friends and family in case there is a need, particularly on the roof side, for storm hardening against the hurricanes that will inevitably make their way to us. On the affordable housing side, there was a bill that I'll lovingly call a glitch bill for Live Local. Anytime, and it's not specific to Live Local, but anytime there is a massive piece of legislation that is truly transformative in the way that the Florida is going to handle doing something, inevitably there's going to be a glitch bill the following year. That was absolutely true this year with Live Local. They did some things, tweaking the law to optimize it a little bit, make sure that it's operating the way that it's intended to, and in many ways bind the hands of local government just a little bit more to stop NIMBYism in affordable housing and workforce development projects. One of the things that President Pasadomo and the legislature were really trying to get at with the Live Local is, everybody in the state likes to, in their words, wax poetic about the problem. Nobody really wants it in their backyard. And so this law was really aimed at how do we make sure these projects get done? How do they get done efficiently? How do we make sure we incentivize them and do it in a way that still honors local government neighborhoods, but make sure that we have housing for our workers and for those who are trying to climb the ladder. So a little bit of optimization on that bill. Workforce development, really looking back on this session, I think one of the stories of it will be the continued investment in workforce development that the legislature has made. We are not that far removed in Florida from thinking that the only way to success in life was a 4-year degree at a state university. We have really come a long way in developing the trades, developing apprenticeship, pushing our young folks who are interested in those things into those jobs, and making sure that we have a workforce for the future. And that was, again, true this year. So continuing education, they did some things on distance learning. They made sure that there was some optimization to the way that certain jobs and trades can get their continuing education, really just kind of optimizing the process for the years ahead as the job market continues to change and grow. Interstate mobility, going back to the growth that Florida is experiencing every single day, this was an effort to make sure that folks who want to come to Florida can have their certification or their license transfer more quickly as they get here and get to work. And so finding a way to ensure that that people that want to come here can work quickly and move their life and their family to our great state. The CTE bill, which became lovingly known as the Kids on Roofs bill during the legislative session, it was really never that. It was really about finding a way, again, to introduce these trades, these technical education programs to folks that are looking for a new path in their career and also at a younger age to make sure that we're developing a workforce for the future. So a lot was in this bill, including the ability for 16 and 17-year-olds to get themselves on job sites, to learn about those construction trades in the real world and kind of get their hands dirty with it, which was, I think, a good thing. I think I'm handing it back to Chris here real quickly on the environment, and then we're going to wrap up and answer questions here in just a minute.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So more on the environment. Not only did they appropriate a bunch of money for environmental priorities, but they, again, in the legislature, continued to push policy that is also supportive of protecting our waterways. And we saw this year a passage of the Safe Waterways Act, which is a continuation really from the Clean Waterways Act of 2020. This one largely focuses on our public rivers, public beaches. It provides additional state oversight over those bodies and additional regulatory frameworks for sampling water quality, for alerting the public if there is any degradation or contaminants that are present. And so, again, the legislature continues to put forward these safeguards for one of our most precious resources. Over on environmental resource management, this is the legislation I discussed earlier about tying those Seminole Gaming Compact revenues to environmental conservation, to water and wastewater initiatives. And so this is going to be truly billions of dollars of additional investment into our water infrastructure in the state, largely powered by those Seminole gaming revenues. So I think Robert has started us on a healthy pathway with his Seminole app. And for those of you who are into sports gaming, you're now can say that you're helping support water quality by doing so.
Contributing more than my fair share.
Moving on from there, we also saw an omnibus bill for the Department of Environmental Protection, really touching a number of different things related to water quality. You'll remember from a couple years ago, there was a move by the legislature to transfer septic system regulation from the Department of Health, which not necessarily makes a lot of sense that it was there to begin with, now to the Department of Environmental Protection. That has continued to be a big lift. That's a lot of regulation to move from one agency to another. This legislation helps to continue that process. It also makes some tweaks to the Clean Waterways Act from 2020 as it relates to reclaimed water, the toilet to tap conversion, as well as the elimination of surface water discharge. And lastly, and probably the highlight of this bill for a lot of us, is the continued focus on resilience. Under the governor's direction, Florida has moved in a direction of recognizing the need for more resilient infrastructure, whether it's more resilient to flooding, more resilient to saltwater intrusion, and the legislature continues to invest and appropriate money into those priorities. Taking of bears, this became one of the more controversial bills of the legislative session. Of course, we do have a lot of bears here in Northwest Florida, but there were substantial issues over around Tallahassee and Franklin County, Wakulla County, where folks were physically being threatened, or their families or animals were physically being threatened by bears on their homestead. So this is essentially a stand your ground bill against bears now. You don't have to worry about being criminally charged if you do shoot a bear in self-defense. So, others have called it the right to bear arms as well. So with that terrible pun, I'm going to hand it back to Robert to talk about local government issues.
Thank you, Chris. Just a couple more slides and we'll be out of your way. So local government actions. This was legislation building upon last year's, was it last year or 2 years ago, the mother of all preemptions, where there's a requirement that a local government issue a cost analysis for local governments or for any ordinance that is going to cost businesses money. This built upon that, added some other new tweaks to local government issues, and sort of is in that vein of the legislature trying to rein in, from their perspective, local governments that are getting out in front of what we want to be in terms of a business-friendly state. Most bad ideas in local government come from South Florida, and they matriculate their way northward. They never make it here, which is a good thing. But this is just kind of another one of those long-standing preemption type bills that binds the hands of local governments just a little bit more. Building regulations. Chris, I'm going to let you talk about this one because you worked on it so closely, and you know this one way better than I do. So I'm going to let you take that one away.
So building regulations, again, affordable housing, we talked about how it's such a priority for the legislature. And of course, we see it in our communities. One of the ways that the legislature, beyond funding of affordable housing programs, beyond the Live Local Act from last year, the legislature has also focused on cutting building regulation, particularly as it relates to residential properties. And this is a continuation of that effort from the last several years. Going back really the last 2 or 3 sessions, we've had a building regulations bill doing things like putting shot clocks on permitting at the local government level, particularly when it's residential or single family residential. This continues that. It puts additional requirements on plan review. So if local governments want to come back with plan questions or comments or corrections that are needed, they now have to tie that to an applicable building code. So they have to say, hey, you're in violation of the Florida Building Code here, you're in violation of the life safety or the fire code here. They can't just send back comments without some type of code citation, and that's aimed to try to help speed up that review process. There were also some pieces of this bill to expand the availability of private provider services. So if you want to use private providers for your permitting or for your inspections, this continues to expand those opportunities throughout residential construction. Tied in with affordable housing, of course, is homelessness, and that is a true reality that we have in a lot of our communities across the state. The legislature has really, I think, acted in response to what we're seeing more so nationally than necessarily what we've seen in Florida. But of course, if you turn on national news, you see pictures of homeless camps from San Francisco, from Seattle, from Portland. And the legislature really, I think, wanted to prioritize making sure that that doesn't happen here in Florida. And so what they did was pass this legislation. It was fairly controversial, one of the more heavily debated bills during this session. But essentially, it prohibits local governments from allowing any type of camping on public property. It gives homeowners and business owners a cause of action to go to the court system if they feel like the local government in their jurisdiction is not preventing public camping in these areas. It does allow cities and counties to establish homeless camps. They can only do so for up to a year. It has to be in designated areas in line with the statute. And then it requires services to be provided at those camps, including, of course, bathroom services, and then bans on drugs and alcohol, as well as access to mental health care services. This legislation, again, was fairly controversial. There are costs associated with providing those services. There is not funding tied to this bill, so there are questions about where do local governments come up with this money. Robert talked a bit about glitch bills. I do think this is one where we may see the legislature come back and make some tweaks to this in coming sessions. But for now, that is the legislation as it was passed. Sovereign immunity, if you've been coming to our updates, you've probably heard about the sovereign immunity bill year after year. There was an effort again this year to raise those litigation caps. So what local governments or state government entities can be sued for. I think there's pretty good consensus among the legislature that the caps should be raised. Of course, the devil's in the details, and the question is, what number do you raise that liability threshold to? And they just couldn't quite get there this year. But I do think this is an effort that you'll see return to the legislature in the coming years until they're able to sort of agree on the right number there. I'm going to hand it to Robert to talk about some law and order bills.
So a few things in the law and order space. The first, you may have seen some of these videos that show up on social media of the street takeovers that happen with folks spinning their cars in intersections and really some scary stuff that can happen with folks who are a little bit out of control. The legislature had already passed a street racing bill a few years ago. Jason Pizzo, former prosecutor out of Miami, really had taken the lead on that for several years, and they added these street takeovers to that. Most important, you can now be criminally charged and fined, not just for the street takeover itself, but for watching it. So it gives law enforcement a chance to actually go and break these things up and apply some penalties for those that are there contributing to the chaos. Unlawful sale of alcoholic beverages. This bill really deals with, it came out of Orange County. You have these abandoned warehouses or abandoned properties that become late night party scenes, and it's become a real law enforcement mess because it's only a misdemeanor, or it was only a misdemeanor to unlawfully sell alcohol. You would think it'd be more than that, but it wasn't. And so as a result, there was really no way to go after these illegal parties that were taking place in abandoned places. And the Orange County Sheriff really led the effort to pass this bill. Good policy that we expect to become law. Grand jury testimony. This really is the Jeffrey Epstein bill. That's the easiest way to describe it. It is a new exemption in the law for the release of grand jury testimony specific, in this case, although there could be future instances, I guess, but specific to the Palm Beach County Jeffrey Epstein case from many years ago. So at some point in the near future, that grand jury testimony will be released. And it was a big priority of the Palm Beach delegation, to Palm Beach County delegation, to really push this forward, and it got done. Critical infrastructure. Last year, the legislature passed a bill that prohibits drones, flying your drones over the state's critical infrastructure. This year, they increased the penalties for trespassing. So the state, locals, the feds are spending a whole lot of money on our critical infrastructure. Think power grids, military installations, seaports, airports. And to have anybody there tampering or trespassing can be a real problem. So drones, you can't fly your drone over anymore, and now you can't trespass without increased penalties. So good policy there for our critical infrastructure. Next slide, I'll just point out, because on the firearm and on gun issues, nothing passed this year. The House moved some issues related to guns, but the Senate ultimately didn't move them this year. My guess is they'll be back year after year. One of those was to remove the age restriction that was passed after the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas tragedy that moved it from 18 to 21 to buy a long gun. There was legislation to move that down, and then also to allow for in your 3-day wait or after your 3-day waiting period to buy a firearm, if your background check was not done. The legislation would have allowed you to go ahead and make the purchase versus waiting for the background check. Again, I don't know that there's an appetite right now to pass these things in Tallahassee, but I do expect them to come back again next year. On the regulation side, this is why you all came this morning, by the way. The grapes are finally free. So we've talked for years about the ridiculous law that criminalized buying bottles of wine that were larger than a gallon. The legislature has finally passed a bill to free the grapes. The governor has signed it. Becomes law July 1st. You can now legally buy your Methuselah bottles of wine, and we can all have a great time together. This is the most important bill that the legislature passed this year. So to our friends in the legislature, thank you. We are all better for it. Vacation rentals, I'll mention only because this was in the Florida House, the closest vote of the year. Was on vacation rentals. It crossed party lines. It was incredibly contentious on the floor during the final days. The legislature has tried to pass a comprehensive vacation rental bill since before Airbnb was just a thought. And so the last time they did it, there was no Vrbo or Airbnb, at least not in the app sense that we know it today. And the legislature has tried every year to kind of, how do you marry and join and not marry, but how do you mesh these issues of property rights and someone's ability to do what they want with their piece of property and local government's ability to control, regulate uses of that property. And that really is where the crux of this issue lies. Last year, they almost got it to the finish line. They finally got it done this year. But what you have now in Tallahassee is a fight brewing behind the scenes about whether or not the governor is going to veto this. He has been known during his 6 years in office to veto things that he views as too onerous on local governments. So on one side of the veto fight, you have the realtors and local governments asking for the veto because it violates property rights, and the realtors in the realtors vein, and the local governments feel like it's too restrictive. On the other side, you have tourism saying, look, it's not a perfect bill, but we need something. We need something that regulates these in a way that kind of sets a framework for going forward. So really kind of a fascinating fight going on behind the scenes as those two sides war it out with the governor's veto or signing pending. Employment and curfew of minors, just a bill that updates our child labor laws. So not overly detailed, but kind of updates us to be more with the times in terms of when and how long our youth can work. Food delivery platforms, the Uber Eats bill. This really, the most important part of this is it establishes some guidelines for the agreements between the food delivery platforms and the restaurants, and it also creates some fee transparency and dispute resolution for when there's a problem. You say you got your food, the restaurant says they gave it to you, you didn't get it, the driver may have taken it, whatever it is, it creates some certainty in the dispute resolution. Chris is going to wrap up with a few other bills that died that may be back next session, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll take this as sort of the lightning round so that we can get to your questions and finish the plane or land the plane here on time. A couple items that we expect to be back. First, term limits for county commissioners. I'm seeing a strong nod here at the front of the room, led by Representative Salzman. The legislature has been open to the idea of term limits on local government. They did pass term limits a couple sessions ago for school board members. They revised those term limits last year. And so this is an item that I think you'll continue to see coming back to the legislature. Display of flags by government entities. This would have prohibited any display of a flag that isn't either the U.S. flag, the prisoner of war flag, or the state of Florida flag on a government building. That became a fairly political and hot topic bill as it was moving through the legislative session this year. In a similar vein was the protection of historical monuments and memorials. This would have preempted local governments from removing any memorials or monuments that have been in place for a certain number of years. Again, became controversial. This one actually died in the Senate committee fairly publicly. Gender and biological sex would have restricted the listing of sex to what is assigned at birth, and that's all that that a Floridian could have used on their government documents. As you might expect, again, controversial. And really, the Senate is where a lot of these more controversial bills died this year. They made it fairly far along, but then in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we just saw most of these die in committee. One that particularly interesting that died was the THC caps for marijuana. This became exceptionally relevant a couple days after the bill died because the Supreme Court of Florida greenlit the recreational ballot initiative. So you will see on your ballot recreational marijuana this year. No caps in place as of yet because of the legislation died, obviously. And so you're going to see a lot of electioneering around that topic as we get closer to the November election. And that, of course, joins the abortion access amendment that will also be on the ballot. So you're going to see some policy-heavy campaigns on these two, in particular, constitutional amendments. With that, we will look ahead real quick just to give you a flavor of what is to come. Of course, we are in the qualifying period right now for federal, state, and judicial offices. Here in a few weeks, we'll have our qualifying for state and local offices. And then, of course, our election dates coming up, August 20th for the primary and then November 5th on the general. And with that, we're happy to take questions. I know we've had the portal to get questions. So Todd will... Oh, okay. So if we have a question in the room, we can take it.
Chris, as you know, the Chamber and NAIOP, the Commercial Real Estate Association, has sought to eliminate the business rent tax. Florida is the only state in the country that charges it. I think the universal recognition on the part of the legislature is it's bad tax policy. It's just how to afford to buy the recurring revenue out of the budget. Can you speak to what's going to happen in the next couple of months in terms of phasing it out, bringing it down, and then your outlook for the future as far as...
Yeah, absolutely. And that has been a priority of the legislature for a number of years, and NAIOP really has led the charge on that, along with the business community and the chamber. So a couple of years ago, there was a bargain made when we instituted the online sales tax collection initiative that dedicated some of those funds to the elimination or reduction of the commercial lease sales tax. So I believe the tax goes down to... Is it 4 or 2% this year?
I think it goes down to 2 this year. They tried to buy it down even further. Ultimately, it was when the legislature acquiesced to the governor's efforts on the toll relief and the insurance premium tax reduction. that was the one thing that had to go in order to pay for it. And so we do expect there'll be another effort next year to maybe bring it down even further, but it will continue to gradually go down towards elimination over the next 4 years.
Yep. So it's on a glide path currently, but very likely that they'll continue to bite away at that even quicker. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I know in the Tax Reduction Act, there was a piece that was added in that all economically should be aware of for people with disabilities. If places hire people with disabilities, I believe it's $10,000 state reduction for up to like 10 full FTEs. If people hire people with disabilities, could you address that at all? If people hire people with disabilities, they'll get a reduction in their state requirements for tax.
Yeah, the legislature has been doing a lot over the last several years to address and help folks with special needs. That hiring tax credit was part of that effort in the tax package. There was also money appropriated to help buy down some of the wait list for services for folks with disabilities as well. So the legislature, I think, in particular, has focused a lot on that issue over the last couple of years and will continue to do so as we move forward. Yep, additional increases coming. Fantastic.
So Robert mentioned property insurance, a little relief there, but is there any kind of...
So you'll recall there was a special session last year, just before the start of regular session, related to property insurance relief. It was said very publicly at the time it was going to take 12 to 18 months for that to really cycle itself through the market. So they did not do much in the way of property insurance issues this session. I would not be surprised to see them take another bite at the apple, either in a special session or perhaps shortly after the elections. There was announcements recently that some of our insurance carriers are returning to the state. Some are making profit for the first time in many years, and so it could be starting to work. Again, I joked earlier, but if you've gotten your renewal yet, it hadn't worked for us yet, but it could be starting. And so, but I think it's going to be an issue that sort of is the third rail of our. I mean, it's got to be dealt with. It's going to continue to be dealt with, and I think the legislature will take another shot at it.
Two questions, forecasting questions. One, when is the governor getting the budget? And maybe a question to the House. I don't know. Any members here who would know. And also, do you see the makeup of the Senate and House different in November?
You want to start?
So when on the
Thanks,
budget.
Eddie.
Thanks, Eddie. Appreciate those. You could ask us after if you want to. No, I'm just kidding. Hearing signs that the budget is forthcoming, potentially as early as next week. There are rumblings that we may see the budget come out next week. Of course, the governor doesn't really have a time frame that he has to act on the budget. Yet when he gets a piece of legislation, there are shot clocks on when he has to either approve it or veto it or just let it become law. The budget's a little different. He gets a little more leeway. Obviously, the new fiscal year starts July 1, so essentially he has to sign it by June 30th in order to have those funds available for use there. So that was the answer to that one. As far as the makeup of the legislature, not really. I don't see a substantial opportunity for the Democrats to make many gains. We do have supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. That's not to say that there won't be a couple of competitive races this year. I think certainly in sort of the traditional battlegrounds, Central Florida, Orange County continues to be one where there are some seats that are truly purple, a couple in the Tampa area, but there's not a whole lot on the board for the Democrats as far as pickups in my mind. I don't know if you feel differently, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, there's a couple of House seats in particular that were effectively rentals. They were seats that shouldn't have gone red, at least based on demographics and trends. When they did, I think that's a testament to the governor's strength last election and just how much he blew Charlie Crist out of the water and had some coattails with him. So there are a couple that I think are very, very dicey for the Republicans to keep. And then what we don't know is the impact of those ballot initiatives and what that will do with turnout one way or the other. And there was one very minor test case in Central Florida this year with a special election. The Democrats did pick up a seat, Tom Keene, but Tom Keene's also a veteran, pretty moderate in terms of his politics. But living in Central Florida, I can tell you all the messaging around that race from the Democrat side was abortion. That was the every ad they ran was that. And so is that a microcosm of something bigger? I don't know. But I think that is one of the unknowns, is the impact of those two issues on turnout.
And I will say that since that is sort of the only canary in the coal mine we've had, I'll say they did some polling and some postmortem on that race, and NPAs in that race broke 2-1 for Keene, for the Democratic candidate. And I know that the chamber and some of the business groups around the state are very interested in, as Robert said, what does the abortion access amendment on the ballot do? Does it drive NPA turnout? Do they, turn out more towards the Democrats than they have historically? Because they certainly haven't turned out 2-1 in Florida in any recent election. So that is something to watch. Excellent. Well, with that, again, always a pleasure to be here. Todd and the chamber team, really, y'all do an exceptional job. So thank you for letting us be a small part of that. One more time, I want to ask our delegation members to stand up. Representative Salzman, Representative Andrade, come on up. And then, of course, our friend Senator Broxton as well, and all the legislative staff. I mean, truly, it is a team effort for Northwest Florida to have so much success, and frankly, disproportionate success to the amount of folks we have in the legislature. So it's a testament to their hard work. And again, thanks for having us.
Thank you, Chris and Robert. As always, a tremendous job. So thorough, so many things happening, and tremendous presentation again, as usual. As we wrap up, I again want to say thank you to our gold sponsor, Centennial Bank. Appreciate your support. Our silver sponsors, Pensacola News Journal and AT&T, thank you so much. And also thank you to Pensacola Christian College for the hospitality, the great food, and everything that y'all do. So thanks for being here. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.